Hello, I'm Edwin Newman, here with Stephen Sondheim, the composer and lyricist of Into the Woods, and James Lapine, who directed and wrote the book. You wrote the book, Jim. Does that mean that this idea was your idea?
Gee, ask Steve.
It really arose because after we'd done Sunny in the Park with George, we wanted to do something funny. And I'd always wanted to do a fairy tale, so I suggested that to James, and that we invent our own fairy tale, sort of quest fairy tale. And we worked on it for a bit, and it didn't seem to be panning out. And then James came up with the idea of taking fairy tales, which he pointed out are very short pieces, and therefore not worthy of expansion, but by combining a number of them, perhaps we could get a full-length piece. And it grew that way.
Let me go back a bit. What is a quest musical?
Oh, a quest fairy story like The Wizard of Oz, where you start here and you got to get to there, and you have a number of adventures along the way. It's picaresque, but always with a goal at the end.
In quest of something.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we talked about many different possibilities. 1001 Arabian Nights, we talked about. Steve likes computer games. Dungeons and Dragons or something?
No, I'm not a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, but that's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons is a quest game, which you're going for a treasure or something like that. The Wizard of Oz is always my sort of paradigm of that.
Why fairy tales? What drew you to that? Is this something that did they mean a lot to you when you were a child?
No, it was the Oz books. Actually, I was not exposed to fairy tales very much, except through Walt Disney pictures. As it turns out, James had read and knew more about fairy tales than I did. But I'd read all the Oz books and was enchanted with the Oz books and loved the movie The Wizard of Oz and the idea of... So I remember reading The Hobbit, too, when I was a kid. And so the idea of a series of adventures with strange creatures and unexpected twists and turns of fate and funny things and melodramatic things and sorcery and all that sort of thing appealed to me. And I thought, knowing James's imagination, that it would be fun to utilize that.
Yeah, I've always loved fairy tales, so it was a sort of natural thing to explore.
Well, there was a mention here of Disney. Now, when you're doing something using fairy tales these days, do you have to take account of what might be called the Disney influence, the Disney style?
It's interesting because I didn't really remember the Disney cartoons. I remembered the illustrations of the fairy tale books. Actually remembered the illustrations more than the stories themselves. The Rackham illustrations in particular. So my reference was very different than Steve's. I don't know.
The Rackham illustrations for...
the Grimm fairy tales,
The
yes.
Grimm fairy tales,
right.
Brothers Grimm.
Brothers Grimm.
Now, well, that leads to a question then. When you were doing this, did you have the Brothers Grimm in mind? Did you have Hans Christian Andersen in mind?
We went to the source of Grimm first. The Disney cartoons are based on the Perrault versions, which is the golden slipper, for instance, in Cinderella, as opposed to the glass slipper, which is excuse me, it's the other way around. It's the Grimm is the golden one, and the glass is the Perrault. And the Grimms are darker and tend to be a little bloodier in nature. So
well, it's almost as though the name Grimm was justified, isn't it?
Also, there's a distinction to be made between fairy tales and folk tales. I mean, Hans Christian Andersen made up his own stories, but these, the ones that we use particularly, are folk tales that exist in virtually every culture. Not Jack and the Beanstalk, which is a totally English invention, and apparently has no parallel in other cultures. But there's a Cinderella story in virtually all cultures, as we found out, and there's a Little Red Riding Hood, sort of, yes? Is there?
Yes, no, definitely.
And so these are really folk tales. You know, it's very hard to, because these are not really fairy tales. In the Perrault version of Cinderella, of course, there's the fairy godmother, but otherwise these are really folk tales.
Well, in Little Red Riding Hood, you have said you either found to be or made to be a pretty tough customer.
That was James starting to characterize.
Yeah, I mean, once we decided on choosing these stories, then the obvious thing was to have a point of view about them. And in the Grimm version, she goes back into the woods a second time and kills a wolf all on her own. And it was that part of the story I'd never remembered, so it sort of bespoke an attitude of this little girl that she wasn't going to settle for one wolf, she was going to go for two.
How did you decide which, I'll call them folk tales, you were going to use? There are so many of them. You came up with, let me see, Snow White is there, Cinderella's there, The Baker and the Baker's Wife, Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel. How did you decide which ones to...
Well, Jim did that, really, but you have to remember that Sleeping Beauty and Snow White only play very peripheral. They really only come on at the end, although Snow White played a little more part in our very first draft that we did when we performed the show out in San Diego. And the Three Little Pigs was there out in San Diego, too, and James had originally written Rumpelstiltskin in there, too. It's just that it got too complex. What he picked, I should let him talk about it, is, you know, 3 stages of kind of pubescence and adolescence as represented by, you know, Little Red and Jack and Cinderella. And also, we wanted to pick stories that were immediately familiar to most viewers and listeners so that we wouldn't have to explain them. The Baker and his wife is another matter, which Jim will talk about.
Well, also, reading the stories, there was just a sort of natural selection based on character and also structure, because as in Cinderella, the Grimm version, she goes to the ball 3 times. Little Red Riding Hood went back twice. You start choosing the stories that will weave together so that you can spin them out. The nature of a fairy tale is it's very short, which is what's wonderful about it, and which is why I think we had difficulty writing a full-length original one, because by nature a fairy tale is short, and I think that's what serves it well. You can jump plot very quickly. And
Jim found that when he was trying to invent a fairy tale, it was all too arbitrary. He said there was no reason. He could invent this adventure, and that's in fact what L. Frank Baum did in Wizard of Oz. You know, those are all arbitrary happenings that have a long way. But you also left out, I think, the major thing that made you center on these things was that all these stories took place in the woods. Many of the fairy tales take place in the woods, but he realized that all of these things took place. And in the Grimm version of Cinderella, for example, when she leaves the ball, she runs up a tree and into the branches like a birdhouse in the tree. I mean, her relationship with the woods is very intense, as opposed to the Perrault version, where she just got her house and her little pumpkin coach and the castle. But in the Grimm version, she relates to the woods.
Well, there is something innately threatening, is there not, about woods, at least to children? Also to me. But
not all children. I used to love the woods. No, I loved the woods a lot more than I loved backyard. But
well, it depends on what kinds of woods. Yes. For example, when I have a house in the country, and next to it is a very dense, dark woods, and Jim wanted to bring the entire cast up there a couple of weeks before we went into rehearsal, or just when we began rehearsal, to show them what it was really like, because there are woods and woods. You know, some woods are kind of pleasant and open and all that, but dense woods, particularly when the foliage is heavy, in the summer months, can be very. You can go in 30 yards, and suddenly you don't know where you are, and then you hear little rustlings, and it does have a menacing quality. It's also, of course, a famous image for, you know, the imagination and the inner life.
When you're doing a show like Into the Woods, which is so different from almost everything else that's preceded it, do you have a lot of trouble getting backing?
Well, it's a different case. In this instance, we had a producer who was sort of interested in it from the beginning. So, I mean, backing is different than it used to be in the days I think you're talking about. You know, shows are not financed anymore by individual investors. They're financed either by theater owners or large corporations.
Or they're usually often begun in nonprofit theaters. We did Sunday and a 2-week workshop of this in Playwrights Horizons, which is a small theater in Manhattan, and that's the germination. And then from there we went out to the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, which is also not-profit. So by that time, we were actually independent, not dependent on a producer until that stage at which we decided to bring it to New York.
Did you regard San Diego as a tryout town? Because I know you changed the show a great deal during and after.
In a sense, yes. Again, you're referring to the days when shows used to go to Boston, Washington.
Yes.
And there's an interesting difference, which is that when you went to Boston or Washington or Philadelphia, there was a specific theater you were heading for at a specific date in New York, which is why so many musicals of the 40s, 50s have very good first acts and not so good second acts, because they never got a chance to work on the second act out of town, because musicals take longer to work on than plays do because of the necessity for orchestrations and things like that. And the nice thing about this kind of so-called tryout, or what they sometimes call a workshop, is that we went to San Diego knowing there was no pressure to come in immediately, that if we wanted to spend 3 months working on the show, we could, 6 months working on the show, or if we thought it was ready, then we could try to push it in. So you don't work under the kind of pressure, and as a result, you can really take a good look at the show. And in fact, we made a sort of major change in the second act as a result of being able to see it out there, which we could not have done if we'd just been on the road, particularly with James writing and directing at the same time.
You mentioned, we mentioned Disney. When you're doing a show like Into the Woods, do you have to take account of any expectation that the audience has that your characters will bear some resemblance to the Disney version?
It was interesting because one of the discoveries of going to San Diego was that people didn't know the stories as well as we thought they knew them. So I did a lot of shortcut kind of exposition, thinking, well, everybody knows that Jack goes up a beanstalk, and then you have this discovery that there are people who don't know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. So it required us to rethink to a certain degree how much information we had to give out. But I think everyone knows of Cinderella. I mean, she's probably the most popular and well-known character. So it was something we talked a lot about. You can't be sort of perverse about your characterization of her, but on the other hand, you have to have a kind of point of view about her.
On the other hand, most people think of Cinderella in the fairy godmother version, in the Perrault version.
Yes.
There's very few people. I used to ask friends, tell me the story of Cinderella, tell me the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, and tell me the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and you'd be surprised at how either they only knew a few details or they had distorted details. Very few people, for example, remembered that Jack went up 3 times. And they knew about the giant crashing and all that. And nobody I talked to knew the grim version of Cinderella, about her going 3 times to the ball. And Little Red, I think, was the most familiar story, although I didn't know about her second visit either.
Does this say anything about what children are being taught these days? Your children, for example, James?
It's interesting because one of the reasons I liked writing it was because as I read the fairy tales as an adult, I could see how you could take the opposite point of view. You can read Bettelheim and find out the great message that they have, but you can also read Jack and the Beanstalk and look at Jack as something of a thief and Cinderella as an imposter, and you can kind of go through them. And I was thinking that it could in many ways offer a child not necessarily a very realistic view of the world, and I think that's what's good and bad about fairy tales. We all want to think of happily ever after, but what we got involved in was the whole sort of notion of community and the realization that you have your individual journeys, but there's also the collective journey, and that's what our second act basically we decided would be about.
Well, to go into the second act, there's a very big number. You are not alone. And I know this has aroused some controversy, because there are people who say that, in fact, one is alone. Do you believe that nobody is alone?
No, they're not listening to the lyric. They're going back to that, we are all strangers and alone, but that's not what the lyric is about. It says, one of the most important words in it says, careful, no one is alone, no one acts alone. The idea is that we are all responsible for each other, and that any act you take has repercussions. It's not about the other kind of aloneness, and it's very clear, but people hear the phrase, and they immediately fall into the cliche because they're not listening to what the characters are saying. And so, yes, I do believe that we are not in any way alone, that we are responsible to each other, and I also believe in the other, you know, that we are all born into the world alone. But that's not what the show's about, that's not what the action is about. And so that controversy comes from people who are not listening to the lyric, and also not taking into account the situation. I really would not like to be the child of somebody who in the middle of the Holocaust says, darling, you're alone. You just have to remember you're alone in this world. I mean, the whole point of Cinderella comforting Little Red Riding Hood is she needs comfort. But there's another meaning beyond that. And that's what the song's about.
There are ballets based on fairy tales, folk tales. There are operas based on them. Was this the first musical to be based on them?
Oh, no. I remember when I was in my teens, there was a show called If the Shoe Fits, which was a real musical comedy version of Cinderella. I didn't see it, but it had a score by a very distinguished composer, David Raxon. No, and I'm sure I could think of others.
Well, there's the Cinderella of, is it Rodgers and Hammerstein?
Yes, which is a television show they did.
And the Princess and the Pea, or what?
Yes, yes, Once Upon a Mattress.
Once Upon a Mattress.
Yep, that was a very successful show. No, they've been done, and that had a point of view too, a comic point of view.
Should we expect more of this kind of thing from the two of you?
Oh, I don't think so.
No.
It's
done.
Well, now, one thing you're well known for, one of many things you're well known for, Steve, is that you like your work as it proceeds to be different from what has gone before. Is that still true?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Does this put an additional strain on you?
No, not at all. It's how you keep your interest up, is not to revisit, or at least consciously not to revisit territory you've been through before. You know, then I think that's just not very interesting to write. I can see some similarities between some shows I've written, but while I was writing them, I didn't see them. Or if I did, I got very nervous, because then you feel that you're rewriting something that you've written before.
You also have...
As I said, after Sunday in the Park with George, Jim said, you know, you want to do another show? I said, let's do something funny. You know, we should just change course. Sorry.
No, you also feel that you have a function as an educator to educate people. Is this something that weighs on you very heavily? Do you take it into account consciously as you go on?
No, I don't feel I have a function to educate. What I've said is that all art is a form of education, and I am a fan of education. I think teaching is a noble profession.
Some of it may be unintentional, then.
Yeah, I've certainly never in my mind. I think anybody who sits down to write a teaching show is, you know, is likely to come out pretty dry. No, I write shows because I think they're fun to write, or or better yet, so I can stand in the back of the theater and enjoy what I'm looking at.
There's an age-old question with respect to musicals, or what used to be called musical comedy. Which came first, the music or the lyrics?
Oh.
Is there an answer to that?
The book. That's the answer.
That's the
book?
answer. That's the
The
answer.
book came first.
Book always comes first.
And then the music and the lyrics.
Yes, but not literally. What happens is you must outline, the way I work anyway, is to sit with my collaborator and talk about the shape of the show, make lots of notes, and then the librettist goes off and starts to shape the characters specifically so that I have some diction to follow and some outline, although we talk about it a lot. It's not a question of in tandem. It's really together, and then let the book must always lead the song.
Now, the book is leading the song of the songs, but in this case, the songs, music, and lyrics were written by the same person, by you. Maybe this is a question that cannot be answered. Do you write the music first? Do you write the lyrics first? Do you write them together?
I write them together. They go like that. I either get a musical atmosphere or a lyric line from a given scene that Jim will give me. And sometimes, as in the case, for example, of Little Red Song and Jack's and Cinderella's, the ones where they step forward and onto the passerelle, James actually wrote some small soliloquies, not so small, but brief soliloquies, which were interlocked. Because that was interesting. We talked, I had written a song for Jack in our very first kind of little workshop at Playwrights Horizons, which I only got halfway through. It was overly complex, but it was a song telling of his adventures in the sky, because I was so worried that the audience wouldn't remember his adventures in the sky. And it seemed overly complex, and then we also thought, what about the people who know the story? They're going to be bored by it. So we decided that what those songs should be about is the characters' reactions to their adventures rather than the adventures. So a hint of the adventures, but what they felt as a result. And so James sat down and wrote some soliloquies, and then I turned in the music. I often write that way with him.
What about the styles of contemporary music? Do you rock music, rap music, electronic music? Do they influence you as a composer?
Only when they're called for, I think. I'm a firm believer in content dictating style and form, and I think, setting Shakespeare to contemporary music is self-defeating unless you're just going to take the story. But try to. I think there has to be a relationship between the two, and so I think just doing rap music because it's popular at the moment, or any kind of pop music, and just laying it on any kind of story is
But yet you sort of chose a rap for the witch.
For a very specific reason, which was to get a lot of exposition across and to give her a kind of feistiness So but it isn't really rap. It's halfway between rap and the Music Man, that kind of technique, which is an old vaudeville technique.
Mm-hmm.
And rap is an outgrowth of that. And so I think it's when it's useful.
Well, you originally planned rap for the witch, blues for the wolf, folk songs for Jack, and operetta for Cinderella. Why did you give up that idea?
Well, I didn't entirely. The wolf indeed has a kind of blues thing. The witch has rap, but not all the way through, because when Jim and I started to talk about the witch's character, it seemed, except for the opening, where she's feisty and pushing to get the baker and the wife to go off on their quest for her own purposes, it seemed useful, but I would not want her singing rap to Rapunzel, and even though her name is Rapunzel. And in the same way, Cinderella sings. I had a more operetta style for her, but as the character developed, it still got. There's a waltz there that she sings, and that's a sort of outgrowth of that. The blues for the wolf was to make him kind of insidious and seductive, and I chose these things because I thought the colors were right for the characters. But then, rather than make it schematic, I just used it where I thought it was useful.
Stephen Sondheim, thank you. James Lapine, thank you.
Thanks, Edwin.
A November Friday in 1963, viewers across the nation watched in disbelief as an NBC News bulletin reported the shooting of President John F. Kennedy. On Sunday, November 21st, WTVS will rebroadcast the continuous 6-hour coverage that followed. Please join us for the JFK assassination as it happened. Sunday, November 21st, starting at 1:56 in the afternoon.